My name is Ed Griggs. I chair the committee. Ms. Isolt? Ms. Ajmira?
It's Malcolm Brown, Charlotte City Council, District 2.
Renee Johnson, Charlotte City Council, 4.
So Wendy, are Ms. Isolt and Ms. Ajmira not on the call?
Ms.
I'm on the
Isolt.
call. Julie Isolt, Mayor Pro Tem and serving at large.
And Mr. Driggs, Ms. Ajmira is not on the call just yet.
All right, good. Well, why don't we get started then? We have a busy agenda today. The first item relates to ethics, and this is actually a late addition to today's agenda, partly as a result of recent events. As you all know, we have an existing referral to our committee to consider our ethics policy, and that referral was in the context of the provisions related to conflict of interest. I think as a result of recent events, I would like to suggest that we also consider, in the context of our review of ethics, our policy on complaints. And what I'd like to do is, with the agreement of the committee, just propose to include this in the agenda for our next meeting and instruct the staff today to prepare for a conversation about complaints and how we handle them at our next meeting, in order to address some issues that I talked about in an email that I sent to everybody on council yesterday. Unless there is an objection, I think what we would do today is essentially just instruct the staff to be prepared for next time. I think that should include a comparison of what policies are like in other cities, maybe a discussion of the issues around these policies that have been encountered elsewhere, some of the problems related to potential conflict, for example, for the city attorney, and see if we can arrive at a better way of handling these than we have right now, which has resulted in media coverage of allegations and counter allegations and complaints and investigations. I think this is bad for all of us. So I would hope that in our next meeting, we can look at ways to improve how this is done. What I would like to suggest today, and run by everybody as a proposal by way of kind of immediate relief on some of these concerns, is a change in the wording, a small change in the wording of our existing policy to take effect essentially immediately. And what I would suggest is, and I'm going to offer this as a motion, but I would suggest that in the existing policy, and I don't know if you have it in front of you, but I will remind you that in section D1C, there's a paragraph that says the city attorney shall review the complaint to determine if it provides the information required in subsection A. If the city attorney determines that the complaint fails to provide the information required in subsection A, the complainant shall be so informed and afforded the opportunity to provide the required information. If the city attorney determines that a complaint does provide the required information, the complaint shall be referred to an independent investigator selected by the city attorney. My suggestion is that we replace the word investigator there and say that the complaint shall be referred to independent outside counsel selected by the city attorney. And then if you read the subsequent section, investigations, part A says the outside counsel, as I would now describe this person, not the independent investigator, shall review a complaint referred by the city attorney. In the event the independent investigator, now the outside counsel, determines that the complaint is either frivolous or does not state a claim of violation, even if the facts alleged are true, then the investigator shall communicate the conclusion in writing to the city attorney, who shall in turn communicate that conclusion to the complainant and the mayor, or if the subject of the complaint is the mayor pro tempore. What that means is that if a complaint is filed, the city attorney makes a basic determination about whether it's properly submitted. It is then referred to outside counsel, who performs a review. And only if the review determines that a full investigation is warranted does Section B then apply here. And the meaning of that is that in the meantime, the member of council against whom the complaint is lodged is not under investigation, but is simply the subject of a complaint that is under review. And I think that would be helpful in the current situation because I think, as we all know, what has been happening is this mechanism of filing the complaint and therefore immediately attaching the investigation tag to the council member in question has become, is in my opinion, being abused. So I guess what I'm moving to making a motion to this committee is that we recommend to full council that with immediate effect, our current policy be modified to replace the word investigator with outside counsel in 1C, and then to replace investigator with outside counsel in 2A and B. Do I have a second for that motion, or would somebody like to discuss it?
I have a question. I'm sorry, Councilmember Driggs. This is Victoria Watlington. Obviously, I'm not on the committee here, so understanding I'm a guest, but can you help me understand as far as the Robert's rules? I wasn't aware that a chair could make a motion. Can you just help me with that?
Sorry, I'm adjusting my computer here. Hang on one sec. I was not able to hear you, Ms. Watlington. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. I was just asking about from a process. Are our committee chairs able to make motion, or is it something that they've got to entertain a motion from the floor?
I guess I would refer that question to the city attorney. If it's not proper for the chair to make a motion, then I would just ask if a member of the committee is prepared to make the motion. Mr. Attorney?
I'm not sure. I haven't seen anything that says that any particular member is not able to make a motion. Typically, the chair entertains motions, but I don't have the actual procedures in front of me. I'm just not aware that the chair is prohibited from making a motion.
Well, let's just talk about it. I mean, the question is, I think the idea is simple enough that we have a step in which a review is being conducted before the word investigation or investigator enters into the thing, and that will kind of lessen the temptation to abuse this process. So is there any member of the committee that is prepared to make a motion like the one I just described?
I'll make a motion.
And do I have a second for that?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
that sounds, we know that it needs to be improved, but do we need to discuss that? I know that you said you wanted to discuss it for, and meet and talk about it during the next meeting because there are some changes that need to be in place. Is that one of them? I mean, there are several things that we think could be changed. For instance, we know the process. You know, if it could be improved as far as being electronic, and there are just different things that we all may have ideas. There might be a difference, but is this something that we want to send to the staff and bring back recommendations before we actually make the change?
So I know that those issues exist, and I was going to go on to say that in my view, the referral that we make or the task that we put to the staff would include a review of the submission process and a consideration of the concerns that you have raised about how these complaints can be submitted. My thought behind this was that in the current circumstances, we have an opportunity to move quickly in order to avoid the situation where any complaint that is filed immediately attaches the word investigation to the subject of the complaint. And I believe that that is an unfortunate circumstance that was not really intended by the original policy and is having unintended consequences today. And those are being reported in the media. So I just think it would be in the interest of council if we can make this little tweak quickly and then recognize that other actions would be taken up at our next committee meeting. That's the thought behind this.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Graham.
I concur. I think what we need to do now is to stop the bleeding of the frivolous complaints that are coming before members now. The most recent one, we can have a complaint on all council members going back 20 years based on what I just saw last night that came in on a council member, which is just, it's frivolous in nature. So I think we need to stop the bleeding with the motion. And then I think council members need to kind of look in the mirror and kind of do some self-evaluation, because this is all self-inflicted. And then I think we really need to take our time to put policy changes in place that's carefully thought out and that's thoughtful. So I think the first step is the correct step that we're making today. Let's stop the frivolous complaints that are coming in, and then hopefully our colleagues will stop doing what they're doing as well, so we can go back to the work of a council, and then we take our time to amend the ethic policy with some thoughtful consideration, and not in this current environment where it's like the wild, wild west. So I call the question. I'm not sure if there's any more to talk about.
Mr. Graham, is that a second of Ms. Eiselt's motion?
I think I made the motion, and I think it was second by someone. I'm not sure.
All right. So do we have, Madam Clerk, do we have a motion and a second?
The clerk is
there a
not
clerk
on.
call?
Yeah, the clerk is not on this call.
Yes. So do you have a motion and a second?
Yeah, I thought I heard a motion from Eiselt, and I think it's a second from Graham.
That works for me.
All right. So you did suggest we call the question. Do I have any other comments before we move to a vote?
Yes,
Mr. Chairman.
This is Councilmember Johnson. I have a couple more questions.
Okay.
Who would the outside counsel be? Is that an independent counsel, or what would that step include?
The wording I'm proposing says independent outside counsel. If the city attorney would like to comment on how he would go about appointing that counsel, please do so.
So I'm not sure that I would necessarily use the team of outside counsel that we have right now, given their connections to the city of Charlotte, but that would be outside counsel that I would select.
And again, the point is independent, and therefore I think the team of our existing outside counsel doesn't qualify. My intention would be that independent means that the counsel in question is not in any risk of being conflicted in the performance of their duties related to complaints. So essentially, you would seek a qualified, presumably a lawyer or a firm, to consider these things and to make that initial determination about whether to proceed with an investigation, and then, if so, to proceed. The appointment of an outsider is within our existing policy. So the only increment we're talking about here is we're calling that outside person outside counsel instead of an investigator. We are not trying to resolve questions that might exist about how the investigator is chosen, the outside person is chosen. I would just like to give a different name to the outside person so that we don't have the automatic association of an investigation with a complaint.
Okay, I agree. And so then we would take this to full council, will be voted on in September. So this would not apply to the current complaints that are, correct?
Not unless and until council adopted it. It's not within our authority to implement this immediately. I do think it would be beneficial for the purposes of public perception if we were seen to address this issue as a committee and make that recommendation to full council, and then it would be considered by full council at the next meeting.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Any other comments or questions before we move to a vote?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Dimple Ajmer.
Hello.
Hi. I'll have to recuse myself from this motion. Mr. Attorney, can I do that? Because I want to go on record recusing myself from this discussion and from this vote.
I certainly understand your perspective there. As I understand the motion, this is for the policy going forward and doesn't impact the current the current complaints that are out there. So I understand. I do believe that you could vote on this motion if you so chose, because it's not actually directly affecting your particular complaints against you or any of the other council members.
I understand, but I guess I don't want it to be even perceived as a conflict of interest.
Understand. And with that, I am. Should you so recuse, I would support that. Yes.
Thank you.
So to that point, Mr. Baker, I have a question. Mr. Driggs, if that's right, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please.
So I actually am thinking about this more now, and I would retract my motion because I think it should apply to every situation, because what has happened is that this policy, the weaknesses have shown through that we are weaponizing this ethics policy. And full disclosure, there was one against me that came out today apparently, and there are inaccuracies in the complaint itself, in that whoever made the complaint was stating that I took donations from developers. One was not even a developer, but I voted against 2 of those rezonings. So I don't think it's fair to have on the record that an investigation against me, when in fact outside counsel might determine that the investigation was not valid for whatever reason, because then you've always got an investigation against a council member, and if that's the case, then every council member should be investigated. And if that's the road we want to down, then we should.
I think there's a difficulty.
If wants to go with this, I'll make sure we go there. But to take frivolous investigations to that level, when in fact there's no evidence that they have broken a policy, and outside counsel has not had the opportunity to review the case before calling it an investigation, I don't think is fair to council members. But if that's the way that we want to go, then I will push to make sure every council member who's ever taken a donation is investigated.
I think there are a couple of issues here. The one is whether or not a conflict situation exists, and if we have 2 members recuse themselves because of that, I suppose the 3 of us who are not yet the target of these investigations could still pass this motion. I don't think we should attempt in this meeting to resolve the more substantive questions, Ms. Islip, that you're referring to. What I'm trying to do in effect is make a small change in nomenclature to minimize the unintended consequences of our existing policy, which is the situation to which you refer.
It doesn't do anything to address the cases that brought this to our attention. And
again, it would be the way this is being offered is that we propose to full council that at their next meeting they consider an immediate modification of the language in our policy, and that would be effective immediately. I think even though there would be cases that might have been referred and were still pending at that point, that action by council would still serve to change the public perception of the referral and kind of try to take the word investigator out unless a further stage of preliminary review finds that a real investigation is warranted. And that's what's needed here, is we need to get the word investigation out unless and until an investigation by someone other than the city attorney, who is not intended to be doing this according to our existing policy, finds that there is merit to the claim, to the complaint.
Well, I would like the city attorney's opinion on this, because I don't think that the situations that brought to light this problem with our existing policy should have to be excluded from consideration. In some cases there are, but if there's, and you can always file another complaint for the same situation.
But there is no exclusion in the way this is being proposed. There is no reference to the existing thing or exclusion of them. This just says, as quickly as possible, can we amend our policy so that it reads the way I just suggested? The difficulty I have with what you're saying is we could get sucked into a premature and unprepared discussion of much bigger issues that really need to be considered by full council. So I was hoping we could make this small change to try and remove the stigma aspect of our current process and then start an orderly review that would be conducted in greater depth at our next committee meeting for recommendations to council on how we get at some of the underlying problems.
Okay.
But I think the most relief I can reasonably recommend right now in response to the current situation is that this committee says when that complaint is filed and it's referred, it gets referred to outside counsel, and at that point it's under review and is not subject to investigation yet.
So, Mr. Attorney, would that apply to anything that has not yet been referred to outside counsel?
So, and very good question. As I'm picturing this committee would be making a recommendation to the council. I think at your next full council meeting is when you'll have that debate about the applicability, whether it's applicable to the complaints that have been filed at that time, or if it's prospective and only complaints going forward. So I think that everybody at this stage, with that, if everybody agrees that that's what you're doing today, I think that everybody can vote on the language that Chairman Driggs has advised, with the understanding that further discussion as to the applicability of it, whether it's applicable to the current claims that are in the pipeline at that time, or only prospective claims would occur at the full council meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, and full council can decide whether to make the change retroactive, immediately effective, applicable only to few. So that question can be considered by the full council. I just would like to get this done today to counteract the perception problems in the current coverage of these complaints.
And with that, if everyone understands it the way that I just articulated it, Council Member Ajmer, I believe that you can vote on this particular matter.
Or if you don't feel comfortable doing that, if Ms. Johnson and Mr. Graham and I agree that this is something the committee can approve, then we can pass it and you can recuse yourself if you feel that you must. So that's up to you.
Mr. Chairman, I think you're right. I think this is only the first step of a wider conversation for council. I think it's a necessary step based on current event. I clearly understand Mrs. Iso's frustration. I would be as frustrated as her. Someone threw out a complaint against me that's baseless. I mean, it's just baseless. But the rules are what they are. And so this kind of hopefully stops that. And I will certainly be willing to make additional amendments when the council receives it to make it retroactive. But I do believe it's worthy of a full council consideration. But I'll say again, and I'm sharing my frustration, the policy is not the problem. We're just cleaning up the mess that we have to. And
Mr. Graham, if I would recommend to every member of council that you read in full our ethics policy if you haven't recently or if you haven't looked at it, because you will find that there are various violations of other provisions in our ethics policy related to how we deal with each other and how council operates that are being committed by various members of council on a regular basis. So I fully agree with you that a lot of what's going on right now is deplorable, but we are in a kind of damage control mode here. And I just want the committee to be seen to acknowledge the problem with these complaints and to have taken some sort of action to try and avoid a plethora, because this could get farcical. I mean, this could become embarrassing to all of us as the public watches its city government devolve into. Yeah, I know. It could get worse, though. You know, we're not all there yet. I'm still waiting for mine.
Yes, it already has, and I concur with you, Mr. Chairman, and I think we just need to call the question again and move on to take care of the real business of the city. This is not what we're here to do.
All right. Well, without further objection, I'd like to then conduct the vote here. So, Ms. Eisel, do you want to vote?
Yes, I do.
And your vote is yes?
Yes.
Ms. Eisel?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Ms. Ajmira?
Said I will recuse myself from this discussion and from this board.
All right. Mr. Graham?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
There's one last thing I'd like to say. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sorry, but I think Ms. Eisel alluded to this, and I think we should just say it. It's, you know, developers give contributions to our campaign, and to say that they're buying our votes or there's anything that's not standard about that, I think that needs to be said, because none of us should be afraid of investigations for that reason specifically. That's standard here. It's public record, and I just think that it does show a vote of confidence for us, and that just should not be something we should say. So yes, I vote. Yes, we do need to kind of stop this bleeding, but I think that needs to be said, because that complaint can be considered frivolous in my opinion as well.
So, Ms. Johnson, I too am a yes. I would just say in response to what you said, the developers, along with everybody else, have a freedom of speech right to make contributions, right? I think our further discussion will go into more detail about what constitutes an improper relationship and what is normal course of business. But I think we should recognize that some support from the development community for members of council is an ordinary course of business thing, and then if there is a concern that under certain circumstances it's improper, we will need to be clearer about what those are. But I think, so what we have is a 4-0 vote with 1 abstention on recommending the changes that were described to full council staff. For our next meeting, I would ask that you be prepared to frame a discussion around changes in our, both in our conflict policy, which was pending anyway, and in our complaints policy to reflect some of the issues that have come to light in recent events. The last comment I want to make is that Councilmember Bakari took exception to my email and pointed out that there is an active dispute right now between him and the city attorney about the question of what kind of discretion the city attorney has, or whether the city attorney is in fact exercising discretion in his interpretation of specificity in facts and matters like that. It was not my intention for myself or this committee to try and adjudicate on those things. So he has made those objections. I think there are questions he has raised that he's entitled to raise and that deserve consideration. But it is not the purpose of this committee by anything that I said or that we do to try and resolve that issue. That's going to have to sort itself out as the process that currently exists moves forward. So with that, I think I lost a bet. I was hoping we could do all that in 15 minutes, but I think it was a good conversation. I appreciate everybody's participation. With that, why don't we move to item 2 on our agenda, which is Mr. Bergman talking about the police budget.
Good afternoon, guys. Mic check. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. While we get the presentation on the screen here, the policy question that the committee received is, how are resources being used within police to promote safe communities and decrease violence in the city. So strategy and budget, and I'm Ryan Bergman, the strategy and budget director, by the way. We produced a quick slide deck, which is certainly not a detailed analysis of the police budget. What it is, I'd like you to think of it as a visual tool of how the police budget is organized so that it can spur requests for information from you guys so that you can do your referral a little bit easier. And while I mentioned this was produced by Strategy and Budget, we do have Kelly Highfoster, who is the Business Services Manager, on the line, as well as Deputy Chief Voorhees, who's over the patrol divisions of police. And they'll be available to answer any specific questions, primarily about services and things of that nature once I finish. The purpose of the presentation, and I won't read the slide to you guys. Yep.
Sorry, you just reminded me, I failed during our introductions to ask anybody else who is on the call to announce themselves. And since you just referred to the chief, might be a good time to do that so the clerk has the benefit of everybody that's participating. So could we hear from anybody who is not a committee member who's on the call, please?
Victoria Watlington, District 3.
Chief, CMPD.
Kelly Highfoster, Business Service Manager, CMPD.
Rebecca Hefner, INT Center for Data and Analytics.
Kelly Flannery, CFO.
Sarah Hazel, City Manager's Office.
All right, so do we have everybody now? Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. Go ahead, Ryan.
Okay. I think we can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to spend one slide on this before I dig a little bit deeper into CMPD's budget, because I think that there is a perception from some people in the community that they pay their tax bill, and this 40% number that's been out there is the percentage of their tax bill that's getting allocated to police. Context-wise, I think it's important that people know that under this consolidated agreement we have between the city and the county, 64% of your property tax bill goes to the county, while only 36% of your property tax bill will go to the city. So we're each in charge of very specific services, education and social services, primarily for the county, police and fire, housing, transportation for the city. So in the context of things, while CMPD does make up 40% of the city's general fund budget, it's important to know that for all services for Charlotte taxpayers, it's significantly less than that when you factor in the county. I do want to point out it's not a perfect comparison because there are about 20% of Mecklenburg County residents outside city limits that also draw from the same services. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I'm trying to present a visual tool for how I would look at the police budget, how our office would look at the police budget. You have that $290 million general fund starting point, but there's a couple pieces of it that I think are important to look at separately. Charlotte Airport and CMS school resource officers making up a combined around $14 million. There's 74 officers at the airport, 51 at CMS. All those costs are reimbursed by those entities. So as far as a city tax bill standpoint, those costs are neutral. And the services are really dictated by request and agreement from Charlotte Airport and from Charlotte School, CMS. The other two pieces, which we can certainly dig deeper into if you would like to, would be animal care and 911. I have them out here because for many intents and purposes, they're separate standalone services. There's only a couple sworn officers in each. In some other places, they might be their own department or they might be part of a general services or things of that nature. But they're performing services which are a little bit different than the rest of CMS. But of course, CMS does operate the services. But that gets you to $257.5 million, which on the next few slides, I'm going to try to dig a little bit deeper in to show you where the money is going. Next slide. So this is the big story of that $257 million. Maybe one of the most important points to get across when reviewing CMPD's budget is such a vast percentage of it is going to pay for officers, their benefits, and then I also have workers' comp insurance in here as well. So 86% of the costs are going to pay for the officers. So when you're looking at the budget, the biggest thing to look at is how many officers, how we're deploying them. And I will return to that in a couple of slides. But I want to focus for a second on the non-personnel piece. So there's roughly $35 million in non-personnel, but 10.9 of that, for lack of a better term, is mostly an accounting mechanism. So we service the vehicles in police out of general services. IT provides some basic technology services to the whole city. There's building maintenance. Those are costs that CMP doesn't have any actual discretion on. It's basically put into their budget to show the true cost of service. However, we put it in their budget and then we take it back out to help support fleet operations, and so it's not really discretionary in that sense, which leaves really $23.97 million, which is the true discretionary budget of non-personnel. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So I put this up here to maybe spur on some things that you may want to review as part of this budget review. I could have put 35 what we call object codes, which are all the different types of expenditures in non-personnel that we have in police. Instead, I tried to organize it a little bit higher level, combine some things into categories. And so what this gives you is an idea of, for the whole CMPD budget, what we spend in each of these categories. Some of them, of course, there's not going to be a lot of discretion, such as gasoline, but they are able to control how much they patrol and things of that nature. But this slide is really to help you guys maybe dig deeper into certain areas if you would like.
Hey, Ryan.
Next slide.
Ryan?
Yep.
On the preceding slide, in the context of the conversations we've been having, where in those boxes do we see purchases of things like the weapons they use, chemical agents, and some of those items?
That would be under department supplies and equipment. So that's made up of things like the small tools, department-specific appropriations. That's where you're going to find the majority of things such as that.
Right. So we may end up, given the conversations we've had in the past, we may end up zeroing in a little more on that one. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Next slide. So let me spend a couple of slides talking about the sworn officer complement that we have in CMPD. We have 1,982 sworn officers. This is approved positions, so vacancies are included in here. From that, you'll have about 128 of them that we're doing the services that I mentioned are either reimbursed or separate, which would be animal care, CLT, 911, school resource officers. So you end up with 1,854 positions. So what you'll see here is that the vast majority of our sworn complement is going to be in patrol divisions, which I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. But then you have these other categories, which these are the way that they're organized from a budget standpoint. But you'll kind of see some of the examples there. Investigations would be exactly what you'd think, investigating murders and vice and narcotics, things of that nature. Administration is recruiting, training, all of the regular administrative functions, the chief, things of that nature. And then some of the special services you'll have, including criminal intelligence, the helicopter unit, and things like that. So each of those are areas that we can provide, work with CMPD, I should say, to provide more detail on however you'd like. But I did want to make the point that the story of CMPD's budget is primarily based around its patrol divisions and those 1,400 employees. Next slide. So this is just a map of the divisions, and I apologize, we can send you this a little bit clearer, bigger resolution to help. But it really gives you the idea of how the patrol divisions are organized throughout the city, and Deputy Chief Voorhees can answer any specific questions about maybe how they break these divisions down and the types of services. But the reality of how it works is that we will budget for these officers in each of these divisions to respond to many different calls and do a lot of different services. So it does make it a little bit more complicated when you talk about break down the budget by each individual service, because you kind of run into a jam here where we're budgeting for entire divisions to do all of that work. And while you can make estimates of what percentage of time is spent on each, it's not organized that way from a budget standpoint. Next slide. And this is something that I provided during City Council discussions of the budget, a little bit of context, because we do get asked the question quite a bit on what happens to the vacancy savings from some of these positions that are vacant. And the reality is that for the most part, you can think of them as slots. And the slots, when there's vacancies, will get filled in a lot of cases by either overtime or, in some cases, retiree rehire officers. The way that we look at it as a budget office is we essentially combine overtime and salaries, and that's the budget that they need to meet, they need to stay under. So if there's quite a bit of savings and vacancies, they will likely use a good portion of it to fund some of the overtime to replace those vacancies. Next slide. And I promise there's only a couple left. I know this is very number oriented. So I want to spend a slide talking about the CMPD budget allocations that are outside of the general fund. So just like any other department in the city, there's an operating budget for police, but there's also typically grants and capital purchases that the department will also have. In the PAYGO fund, we added $2 million for technology. And one of the main reasons we've done this is our radios. We have a life cycle management concern with our radios, where a lot of them are coming due for replacement at about the same time. I think a lot of them were funded back in 2012 from that DNC grant. So we've been dealing with that over the last couple of years. The only CIP project that was in the plan this year for police was replacing a 22-year-old helicopter. This had been on CMPD's CIP request list since FY 2015, but it kind of took a back seat to some of the stations that had been built, some of the division stations. The goal of this replacement is that as the two helicopters they have currently get very old, beyond warranty, 20 years old, there's more and more concerns that if they end up with only one, they'll have no support in the air for when one goes down for maintenance. So we did put that one in the budget. The only difference there is that there's no discretion for them on that. City Council would need to approve a purchase like that, and it can't be used. That money cannot be used for anything else. And then the General Grants Fund, where you'll hear a lot of things about police purchases with the Police Foundation or asset forfeiture. That's separate from tax dollars. It's kept in what we call the General Grants Fund, which is also where we keep fire grants and a few transportation grants and things of that nature. But you kind of see the information there about the estimate for FY21 in those categories. And again, this is another area where, if you're interested, we could try to provide any information that you request. Next slide. And this slide really doesn't add anything that I haven't already talked about. I just wanted to put all of the resources together on one slide for what I had talked about, which encompasses beyond the operating budget, just like it would any other department. You'll see the breakdown of personnel, non-personnel, and then some of the capital and grants accounts that I mentioned. Next slide. So I sort of mentioned some of these, some considerations to take into account. We don't organize our personnel dollars down to the minute detail of the services that were provided, because so much of our police department is patrol divisions responding to calls for service. So that does create some limitations, and we to go a little bit deeper than that, we'll certainly need to do some help and some analysis, which we are happy to do if that's where you would like to go. And then the other part is, as you're looking at the budget, if you're considering things like looking at areas where other departments, non-sworn officers may respond to certain levels, we're happy to help with that research, and I'll talk a little bit about that next slide. But it is important to note that, let's say that you have 11 officers at a time in one of the patrol divisions on duty, taking one service away only results in dollar savings if instead of 11, now you only need 10, or now you only need 9. So everything has to be kind of considered together if the goal is any kind of adjustments to the budget. And then finally, under non-personnel, as I mentioned, just the point that I think we could, as a committee, I think you guys as a committee could focus on some of the non-personnel areas to do a deeper dive if you kind of take the recommendation not to do the deep dive in the areas where police really has no discretion, as I mentioned. And then final slide, please. So this is more about strategy and budget in general. We're of course separate from CMPD. We do have a number of analysts whose job it is to research, to analyze. We've been supporting the Safe Communities Committee. We're going to support this committee. But we also do work for the city manager during the year that isn't always council directed. It may be something that he wants us to research going into the next budget and things of that nature. And he did want to make it clear that while we are doing everything that the committees want and we are going to follow the lead there, we're not going to rest on our laurels beyond that. We're continuing to review and evaluate options, innovative programs throughout the country on how some other cities and localities have addressed many of the same issues that we're looking at or are starting to address them. So with that, I think there's one more slide, which is just the slide to park it on, which has the referral topic, the policy question. I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chairman. And as I mentioned, I'm available as well as a couple of CMPD representatives to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ryan. Great job. I want to welcome Councilmember Winston on the call. I'm not sure you were here for introductions. I don't see any hands up. Are there questions for Mr. Bergman? So,
just a request, if he can send the council a copy of the presentation. I thought the presentation was well put together and would love to study a little more closer.
I just wanted to, yes, you got that, Ryan, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, I think we have at least 1 or 2 members of community safety also on this committee. I think the goal of this exercise was to consider the financials of the police department in terms of, the call for defunding or for reallocations of resources and so on. So I want to make sure that this committee coordinates with Safe Communities and comes up with data that will usefully inform that conversation. So if there are any thoughts about information in addition to what we've seen here today, I hope that we'll hear from anybody who was a member of both committees and can get some guidance on that. And if there are no further comments, we shall zoom ahead to item 3 on our agenda, which is the...
Mr. Driggs?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, I was around for introductions, but I was not in a place where I could ring in. So I haven't been listening in. I will say I know that there was a discussion around verbiage to use in regards to an audit or understanding budgets. I do believe there is value in understanding the line by line where the money goes. As the community, there's significant community interest, not just to know, but as the community tries to partner with us to suggest pathways forward to reimagine our role in community safety. For example, we were able to talk about chemical agents earlier this summer, and the ability to kind of put a cost behind the way operations work is helpful in being able to suggest pathways, different pathways to go policy-wise in terms of how law enforcement operates in community safety. So I think that's what the community is looking for. And if there's a way we can kind of drill into the minutia of those numbers, it will and can be effective, I think, for the ongoing work that many different committees are going into right now.
So, Councilmember Winston, if you've ever looked at the line-by-line internal accounts of any large organization, you'll see that what you could end up with is a 100-page printout or something. And I think as council, we need to kind of get the information that is in there that is pertinent, rather than taking upon ourselves going through every single line. And that's why I just raised the question, are there areas in what we just heard that call for greater detail in order for us to be responsive to the community conversation that's taking place right now? And there's got to be some middle ground where we avoid, seeing how much money was spent on cleaning supplies, and can identify exactly what it is we're looking for, in respect of which we want that kind of detail. So I would just kind of throw that out there, but
no, I think you're absolutely correct.
We can be practical about this.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely correct. It has to be done. That's one of the. How do you do that effectively? I think one of the questions you asked earlier about drilling into what was it? Where ammunition is under
equipment. Yeah, the
equipment. For instance, that's probably the main area that people are looking at. So,
right, well, that's what I meant. I think what we have here is a map. We have an overview, and we have an indication of some of the limitations in terms of like explaining every minute of every officer's time and so on. So the idea is maybe to iterate a little bit, talk to safe communities, find out where the greater detail is needed, or consider any areas that might be considered eligible for a diversion of funds. So if we think that the department is spending too much money on such and such, then let's look at the details of what money is being spent on such and such and consider the implications of reallocating that. But I think there needs to be a little bit of back and forth between us and safe communities to identify what data is helpful in the greater conversation that's going on right now. So appreciate those comments. I think Ms. Ajmera also wanted to speak.
Mr. Driggs, my question was already addressed.
All right, thank you. Then why don't we roar ahead to the violence prevention data matrix.
Mr. Driggs?
Yeah.
Ms. Watlington has a question.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ms. Watlington.
Real quick, to your point, Ed, I just want to offer up a little bit of insight on the Safe Communities Committee. I mentioned before, whenever you're looking at large organizations' financials, you find out real quickly that much of it is spent on materials and headcount. And so from a diversion of funds standpoint, I'd be most interested in coupling this budget information as it relates to the overhead costs to our org structure. I'd be interested if there are particular divisions in which overtime is excessive versus others, because that might be a place where we do in fact need more heads, and we've got, it looks like, the response times that we can connect our output metrics to that. To your point about, and I think, and maybe it was Ryan's point about reducing head to deliver actual bottom line savings versus top level productivity savings. I think that is the question we really need to hone in on. One of the things that was in the follow-up questions from the safety committee was an understanding of what are the tasks the police officers find themselves involved in. It's not a, to your point, a minute by minute analysis, but we may be able to understand what are those particular tasks that we can pull out that don't for an officer, and get an assessment of whether or not that results in actual reduction of heads, which then would bring us some savings. Then the other piece of it on the material side, I'm wondering from a supply chain standpoint if there are any savings that we can get by leveraging scale with our procurement, not just within CMPD, but within the other city departments. So those would be the places that I'd be interested in seeing to drive those discussions.
Right. So, Mr. Bergman, do you understand what is called for, or should we suggest that Ms. Watlington supply in writing exactly? I mean, I think you make good points, so I just want to make sure that that input is actionable. Mr. Bergman, do you need a little more detail or clarity about what exactly that entails?
No, I understand her points completely. And as I mentioned, our office has been very involved with both communities, both committees. So we know the call for service data that they were looking at. And as she mentioned, the overall question will be what any changes and how do they drive that head count?
Right. And I just think we need to be clear. This is a budget committee, right? So we are really looking at mainly about the commitment of financial resources, the allocation of financial resources. And I would not want to intrude on policy questions being considered in the other committee, you know, about how they're tasked, how officers are tasked with things like that. You know, we're trying to answer money questions here. So,
Mr. Chair, the only reason I brought that up, I totally agree with you. I only brought that up as it impacts the actual head reduction, which then would impact the OpEx cost. That was the only reason. But to totally
right. Good point. Okay. Do we have anybody else who wishes to speak? And Ms. Watlington, if you would take your hand down, let's go to then to Violence Prevention Data Matrix, Ms. Hefner.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today in committee. I am going to share with you some information on the work we've been doing around data and valuation as it relates to the city's violence prevention initiative and how it might be applicable to the work that you are doing now. So today we are going to look at the data and valuation work and share with you what's being published and collected and what kind of capacity we have at the organization. And also the same information, it can be used to make informed decisions about the work before you, about CMPD's programming and allocation of resources. We're overall making an effort to use data and evidence to be more effective, so that applies here with CMPD, but also all of their partners as it relates to violence prevention. Next slide, please. We have a variety of organizational capacity around data and evaluation. My team, the Center for Data and Analytics in Innovation and Technology, does all things data related, managing, storing, moving, delivering, visualizing, publishing, analyzing data. You've seen a lot of dashboards from us recently, but we also have expertise that we can provide to the organization around research, analytics, and program evaluation. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department has a robust and talented crime analysis division. They do a lot of the support for CMPD in terms of investigations and real-time analysis, but they also have great expertise in evaluation and analysis of crime data. And then, of course, Ryan just referenced the work that the Strategy and Budget Office does as part of their normal operations related to analyzing effectiveness of city programs. When we don't have capacity within the organization, we have great partnerships to seek out additional help and resources when issues of data and evaluation arise. Next slide, please. This is a reminder just of the framework to address violence that was created earlier this year. And this is what my team has been working on under the category of use, data, and evidence. I'll share a little bit about that with you today. Next slide, please. In this framework, the purpose of calling out the use of data and evidence is so that we can really have a explicit focus on having data-informed decisions and the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices. In order to do that, we have to be able to share data and information across our departments, our agencies, and with community partners. That is our stated purpose. We have been doing a couple of things already over the last several months. One is that we've established an interagency data sharing team. It's called the Violence Prevention Data Collaborative. I chair that with an epidemiologist from the Public Health Department named Donna Smith. Shout out to Donna, who's fantastic and has been helping with this even in the midst of all of the contact tracing work that her team's doing as part of COVID. But that group also includes representatives from our other partners at the county, public health, social services, as well as Atrium, CMS, and our partner universities. It's a team that is has a lot of work planned in support of the violence reduction work. The next piece is publishing a violence data dashboard. I'm actually going to share a little bit more about that with you today and some screenshots. That is a place to publicly share violence-related information in a more visual and easier to understand way. And the last piece of our current actions, we've been working with a student at UNC Charlotte and the Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration to build capacity for grassroots organizations to measure results of their work. As you know, our partners are a really important part of how we address violence in our community. Next slide. So just to share a little bit about the Community Violence Data Dashboard, the context around this, of course, the dashboard is part of the city's violence reduction framework, but it's also part of the broader community plan that is being led by the Mecklenburg County Health Department, and the city is partnering on. So the context we're trying to demonstrate through this dashboard is that violence is recognized as a public health issue. We've been talking about that a lot. We believe that a better understanding of the data highlights how important it is to have this comprehensive cross-sectoral approach, that it's not the responsibility of any one partner to reduce violence. And the dashboard that we have, it is in development and in progress, and currently what we have is a violent crime counts and demographic information as it relates to violent crime. Now, it is in progress to build out with that data collaborative group that I referenced. We're working with our partners. Eventually, we will be adding information around social determinants of health, again, so that we can really understand what are those contextual factors that contribute. But we'll also be adding indicators around things like childhood exposure to violence, youth violence, and emergency department visits, for example. So we will be building those out with our partners over time. And I do just want to make a note that this is a really big deal. This is the first time that we have put out, crime data in this way, with the automatic updates wrapped around with this kind of information. It's also the first time that we've had such a strong partnership. Well, can't say first time. In my tenure, I've been here now 7 years, where we've had such a strong partnership working across city and county agencies to share data together and all in one place. So it's really exciting for us. We've been working towards it for a long time, and I just want to emphasize and thank council for your focus on this, is what has made it happen and come together. Next slide, please. This is just an example of one of the tabs on the dashboard that will be, again, public facing. This is the violent crime counts tab. And so we're pulling together information about the type of violent crime and the concentration within priority areas and the distribution of activity across the jurisdiction, and counts year over year. So the other currently built out tab is around demographic information, and then we have a context tab, and again, the other items will be added over time. This is this place where we will be able to compile information from CMPD and our partners all together in one location. Of course, is really initially designed to support the violence reduction work, but again, can also help y'all make informed decisions about programming and allocation of resources as it relates to CMPD, because this will help everyone better collaborate to reduce crime and prevent violence. Next slide, please. With that very short overview and a quick glimpse at the dashboard itself, I will turn it back to the committee chair for any discussion as it relates to measuring the effectiveness of violence prevention.
Thank you, Ms. Hefner. Great job. I get really excited about this stuff. I love quant people, so appreciate your work. Are there any questions from the committee?
I just have a comment, Mr. Driggs.
Go ahead, Ms. Pro Tem.
I just want to say to Ms. Hefner, thank you for pushing hard to get the data and the dashboard that we need. I think this was before you were working on this, but I remember meeting with Chief Putney with UNCC 2 or 3 years ago, and it just was clear to me we couldn't get that data at that time, and we didn't have the framework for it. So I think this is foundational for everything we do with regards to any kind of path forward with our police department, with our crime intervention, with violence as a public health, reframing that discussion. And I'm really grateful that we're really moving this forward. So thank you.
So is Chief Voorhees still with us?
Yes, Councilmember Driggs. Good afternoon.
Well, welcome. I just wanted to kind of put to you the question of where is the tie-in between this data work and decisions that you make? I mean, are we going to arrive at a point where we can identify certain initiatives or practices and actually put numbers to how effective they have been in reducing crime? Because the ultimate goal of this whole program of evidence-based law enforcement was to kind of identify what works and be able to show with data that it works. So are you able to make that connection?
Well, I think the crime data that we use is what we provided, and we look at those areas where crime occurs based on density and number of incidents and types of incidents. So it's no matter what the crime problem is, it's not just violent crime, but in particular violent crime, we have some chronic hotspots that marry up what the city has been emphasizing. And so I think what's unique here is all the other inputs that we're going to get from the other sectors that we don't normally look at. So I think from crime numbers, obviously that's what we're primarily tasked with, but it'll be interesting to see when we kind of collaborate across various other entities and how effective we can be. That'll be an enhancement to what we're doing potentially.
I know that you use data on a real-time basis to make even ground-level decisions about deployment of officers and so on. So I'm really just talking about from a council standpoint as we go through our overall review of CMPD. Are there ways we can incorporate some of this this data into in any changes we might be contemplating or any opportunities we might identify? So not to kind of interfere too much with how you do your job, but just for us, what are the policy implications of the data?
I think we're on board 100%. I don't think there's any anything that I would offer there to you. If I understand what you're asking, I don't think it's. I think we're all on board with whatever we can do to prevent violent crime, and so I'm happy to see other people come to the table and be a part of that effort.
Right. I think I'm just giving you a glimpse of the murky world of life on City Council. But I appreciate the work you're doing, and I think this data is really useful. Do we have any other questions or comments about the data? If not, we still have some time to get to our fourth agenda item, which is prioritizing projects funded by hospitality revenues. Ms. Flannery.
Well, I lost a bet. I thought that we were going to run out of time before we got to mine, but
this is how you're prepared.
Yes. Wendy, are you bringing up the deck for me?
Us to get this far either.
It's loading.
Oh, sorry, Donata. Thank you. So while she's pulling it up, just a reminder where we are. This is round 2 of hospitality. This was from a referral that came out of the retreat back in January. Donata, if you can go, I'm on the next slide. Just coming up with a process around how we decide which investments we're going to fund with the hospitality revenues. And on the next slide, I think what I took away from the last meeting was there were really 3 priority areas that you wanted to focus on. That was, what is the criteria around which we make decisions as it relates to hospitality revenues? What are the appropriate financial policies, and how can we strengthen reporting and when we come back to council and have the frequency around that? So on the next slide, I think before we can draft policy, it's kind of important to establish really some guardrails on any sort of investment that we're thinking about moving forward with. So I came up with these 5 that I think are reflective of council's priorities as well as policies. And so that would be any investment that we're contemplating should result in some sort of economic growth while also maintaining financial stability. Anytime we can leverage funds, we should be able to, whether that's with a not-for-profit partner or in a P3 type of situation, as well as the investment should be long-term. It shouldn't just be a short-term impact to the city. And the other thing we need to maintain is the assets that we currently have. So we need to ensure that we're not sacrificing our existing assets in lieu of new ones. And then, of course, adherence to city council policies. So on the next slide, as I mentioned, I think the one thing that I took away from the last time was that you wanted to have a set criteria for each investment that you review. So I've worked with CRVA as well as the ED team and budget and kind of come up with this list of things that staff thinks is we can commit to presenting to you on each of the investments we've asked for you to review. Obviously open to any ideas. If there's anything you want to add or amend, open to it. But we heard a lot about economic development impact. So obviously job creation, return on investment, things of that nature. Those are things we already do, but we want to just codify the process. Every time we bring an investment, there'll be a complete funding plan, not just the portion that's funded with hospitality revenues, but whatever other sources are coming in, as well as compliance with the financial policies, which we'll discuss on the next slide, and an affordability analysis that will extend not just on the short term, but through the life of the project, as well as the existing projects that the city's already funding. And then what are the impacts to the community outside of the hospitality revenues? Is there commitment to MWSBE? Is there affordable housing component? Will it increase upward mobility? All those kind of criteria are things that we will commit to bring each time we bring an investment for consideration to council. On the next slide, I think it was Councilmember Ajmir was asking about what's the appropriate amount of debt. And I think what's interesting and difficult about the hospitality funds is that there's 3 different funds and they have 3 different uses. And it's difficult when you're talking about financial policies to kind of look at them holistically. The one thing that we've always done and we will continue to do is reserve next year's fund balance, and next year's debt service within fund balance. But I think there's opportunities to be more restrictive, and there's no magic number. These aren't rated like geo bonds. There's no magic formula that says this is the appropriate amount of debt, because these funds are mostly capital funding debt. There's not a lot of operations on it. So you couldn't say this is the right amount. But I think if we can come up with some other policies around that, we can get comfortable that we're making responsible decisions. So one of those is one that we've always done in practice, but would just be codifying as well, is that any debt that we structure long-term, we will pay 50%, at least 50% of it off in the first 15 years. And typically we borrow for 30 years. So we will say that we will commit to pay half of it off in the first 15. As I mentioned, there's a lot of capital costs in the funds, but we should codify that we won't ever spend more on operating expenditures than we will on capital. So the purpose of these funds is to fund capital and build assets, and we should make sure that we're doing that. The fourth thing I think is new, and I didn't put it in red because I forgot to fill it in, but I'm looking for a little guidance here. If we've learned anything in the last 6 months, it's that anything's possible, and a recession is a very real thing. And on economically sensitive taxes like this, we have to be thoughtful. And in the general fund, we have the operating fund reserve, which we always have as 2 months worth of operating costs in reserve. And then the general fund, we budget debt service separately, which we always have 50%. We don't have something similar on the hospitality revenue funds. My recommendation would be, and I think percent's the right way to go, because each fund has different sources and dollars, are fungible and change every year. But I think we should think about a percent of revenues every year post the 1 year's debt service requirement of fund balance being restricted in the event of another recession. And I'm still kind of modeling that out before I can make a recommendation to you. But it wouldn't be, material. It's not going to hinder capital construction going forward, but just an amount so that when you come to me and say, how much can we afford? I shouldn't give you every single dollar. There should be an amount that we're restricting even beyond the debt service that says, in case of emergency, we've held this back for ourselves every year to make sure. And then the other thing that I think...
Hey, Kelly?
Yeah.
To that point, based on recent experience, you could make the case that the revenues for the hospitality funds are a lot more volatile than the cities. So is there any presumption that we should use as a starting point the city's policy of 2 months, I guess it is, of fund balance?
Well, my initial thought was 2 months was too low, but then when you think about, we're sitting on a really robust balance. So that I think I want to do a little more homework before I throw out a number. I think 2 months might be the right number, even with the sensitivity around the taxes.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
And then I was looking at the other contracts, and NASCAR, the Hall of Fame fund's really easy because it's just one thing. It's just the NASCAR Hall of Fame. Whereas the convention center has the convention center, and it has Bank of America, and tourism has, Discovery Place and Levine and all the different ones. But the thing that stuck out about the NASCAR Hall of Fame was that there's a maintenance reserve fund in that contract, and it's de minimis. I think it's $250,000 a year that gets set aside out of those revenues in the event that there's becomes some sort of repair that needs to be done. And if it's not used, it just keeps building and keeps building. And as our assets, they're not old, they're not in bad shape, but we are, we're 10 years into the whole Living Museum campus. It might be something we want to think about. And then again, I haven't quantified it yet, but coming up with something small that we start building up a maintenance reserve for each of those funds. Just so that when we get to the point where we need to do a repair, it's not a come to council, beg for a multi-million-dollar repair, because it's been a deferred maintenance, but it's something that we've been able to address as it's come up. And then the next slide, this goes to your question about how frequently do we come to you and what do we bring each time. And so what we did at the last retreat that I think was successful, though I think Tracy's piece was successful, I think I could have done better. But the plan for that is, historically, we would just bring an affordability analysis and it would just say, here's how much money you can afford. But I'd like to introduce the concept of a financial policy dashboard, which would be a dashboard that would compare whatever policies we come up with now to the goals going forward. So it would be, if we decide that, 50% debt service is right, then that would be a policy, and it would compare going out the life cycle of the debt, proving out that we're actually following our policy. So it wouldn't just be, here's the number, here's what we can spend, but actual evidence that we're following the goals that we meant to do and that we're proving that out and bearing that out to you every year, as well as the ED team or whomever with projects have been approved and talk about the status of those projects. And at that point, we would talk about what I'm calling horizon investments. And those are ones that we talk about a lot, but there's no financing plan. We don't really have a scope. We don't have a cost. We don't really know if there's a business case. But at minimum, we will commit that every year we will do a complete overview of the projects and investments we're contemplating. And then the other thing that was new, and I've talked to CRBA and they think it's a great idea as well, and I'm just pointing them out because they're the only ones that have an active project under construction right now, is when there are projects and investments that are currently under construction that council has reviewed, that we ask whoever the recipient entity is, so take the construction of the convention center, for example, every quarter through the construction completion period, that entity has to come in and give an update on budget to actuals, planned encumbrances, making sure the cash flow is still good, and highlight for council if there's been any changes to scope, schedule, or funding. And I think that's a really nice way to not get the surprises that I heard the last meeting had become kind of commonplace. So with that, that is all I had. I think I'm looking for next steps and reactions to what you just heard. Mr. Driggs, you're on mute.
Any comments from members of the committee? I think everybody has been probably softened up by the earlier committee meeting, but Kelly, I wanted to say for one, I think this is very valuable, and council will appreciate that if we're ever in a situation again like we once were, where we got a sudden request for $40 million for soccer, and nobody really had any idea, how to assess it. Would you anticipate then, if you move forward, that council would get for any proposed investment like a data sheet that kind of incorporates a lot of the points that are in your graph there?
Yeah, I originally had thought naively there would be an opportunity to do some sort of scorecard. And then as I started to put it together, because all the projects are so different, a major sports arena is very different than, a children's museum, and scoring it just became impossible. But yeah, at minimum, we would provide some sort of, I don't know if we could do it on a one-pager, but one-page-esque kind of bring down of all the criteria, the financing plan, kind of a back of the envelope for each investment that we'd ask you to contemplate.
Right. So then, we could do the scorecard stuff, I guess, on our end, but at least we would have an organized presentation of those numbers. I personally like the ideas that you have about these fund balances and the reporting. We have had a kind of a very loose relationship. We get asked to vote on these investments, and the basis that we have on council for knowing whether they're good or not or how they compare with others hasn't been good. So really appreciate this work. I guess my other question then is, this is an information meeting right now. What do you imagine, assuming that by its silence, the committee is in support of what you've offered here, how would you intend to move forward?
I think the original charge was for a written policy. So I think if the next step for me would be to actually put a pen to paper and start drafting policies and give you something to react to, that would be reflective of what we just discussed.
Good. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Kelly. That was a great presentation. I like the recommendation to have the updates for the construction, but Mr. Driggs, is that something that we could expand as the governance committee for instance, the Hawthorne Bridge project recently. There's a lot of times that we could ask for updates to make sure that these large projects are on task and within the scope of the budget. Is that something that we could expand for, as a committee to take a look at?
So, Ms. Johnson, I would say that the report that we got from the internal auditor raising concerns about our management of capital projects and so on is a basis for us. We left it in our last meeting that they would come back to us and give us an update on status. But I think that's the context in which we can do exactly what you say. I mean, we're going to need to see some solutions or some progress on the issues they raise. And it would be a great opportunity for us to then suggest, okay, we want to hear about the status of these projects on a scheduled basis regularly and not find ourselves like we did on the Cross Charlotte Trail, to mention another one. So I think we're covered there. I would like to maybe follow up with the internal auditor and combine what you're suggesting with the work they're already doing on how we manage those projects.
Can I just add, I think this is a little different because, well, it's the city's money and we dole it out. The actual selection of a vendor and contractor is done by the recipient agency. I think that's why it's important for the hospitality policy to have this kind of in its own space and not get muddied up with the actual work that the city is doing.
No, I just think there are things you've just said to us that have applicability to our other capital, and we would certainly want to get the benefit of that. Okay, is there anybody else? If not, I note that it's 3 minutes to 4, so we have nailed the landing. I appreciate everybody's participation today and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much. Do I need a motion to adjourn?
Moved.
Second.
All right, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay,
Aye.
we're unanimous.
Thank you.
Let's adjourn. Bye-bye, everybody.